I think, as the other deputies have said, road safety is an enormously important issue. The purpose is clearly to set up a system whereby we can reduce fatalities as much as possible, and there are many different cogs, if you like, in that wheel. I think the system has to be absolutely transparent, and I think it does feed into many aspects that other deputies have touched. And I'm not going to hugely repeat points, but I'll maybe deal with some of the issues that the Minister is attempting to address. Firstly, in terms of young drivers.
You're sharing your time with
I am.
Clare. Is that agreed? Agreed. Okay.
Yeah, that's grand. In terms of young drivers, I think this is an area that needs careful attention. I think in many ways, like the benefits that accrue to young people who engage in sporting activities, I'm all in favour of young people having cars, because I think it actually can teach them to be more responsible and more careful if it's done properly. And experience in other countries would show that part of that education really should be dealt with in the school curriculum. So while I appreciate the Minister's measure in looking at a requirement to undergo a minimum of logged accompanied driving experience and so on, that obviously means extra cost. I think we'd have a far greater impact if road safety was taught in the schools, and even, to be honest, if a certain amount of driving experience was engendered in school. I think all round it can help people to be more responsible. I think in terms of the areas of drivers who are intoxicated and the changes in the testing regime which the Minister proposes, I actually have sympathy for a number of the points made by Deputy Ellis, because when you get into the realm of non-technological cognitive tests, well then you're dealing with, you have to rely on the evidence of maybe one Garda, maybe two, up against the witness. And where's the corroboration for that? If that Garda, for example, had an agenda against the person whom they stopped, they carried out a test, Moraya, it wasn't a technological test, which the evidence of which is there for all to see, but it's based on their arbitrary, visionary assessment of the situation, then I think that could be discriminatory towards the person who was called up. And I think there are areas where that could be misused by the Gardaí in instances, and I would be quite worried about that. In terms of the issue of the commercial vehicle roadworthiness, again, this is incredibly important, because it's not just driver activity, but it's vehicle roadworthiness which dictates whether road safety will be enhanced or not. And I think this is an area which has been riddled with inaccuracies in terms of the types of vehicles. For example, we have changes in taxi regulations where a taxi driver could a maximum carry 4 or 5 people, where a taxi over the age of 15 has to be taken off the road. But a bus over the age of 15 years of age is absolutely fine. There's no problem. Where the reality is age actually on its own is not really a determinant on whether a vehicle is safe or not. The testing that should be done should be able to stand up regardless of the age of the vehicle. And in that sense, I would be quite worried, because I have had dealings with people who operate commercial vehicles. One resident who was in touch with me, who purchased a vehicle which had a full roadworthiness certificate attached to it. He bought the vehicle, brought it back, noticed quite a few things wrong with it, even on a visual inspection, had a private test commissioned himself, and found that the vehicle actually failed on a whole number of accounts. Now, on his behalf, we've been taking up that issue with the Road Safety Authority and others to say, how could this reputable centre certify this vehicle as roadworthy when 2 other subsequent organisations said that it clearly wasn't and couldn't have been at that time. And I have to say, the Road Safety Authority haven't really been hugely helpful in that regard. They carried out a very casual inspection. The person didn't get a written report or anything like that. So I wonder, is this going to be addressed in the new regulations, and how can we really say that the vehicle roadworthiness issue has been addressed or not without doing that? I think it's really very, very important that we would look at it. But the main points I want to make really are in relation to the penalty point issue, because there's absolutely no point in adding on a whole plethora of other offences that are going to be covered by penalty points if the system that we have at the moment has a big question mark over it. And the reality is that the dogs on the streets know that it is, because contrary to what Deputy Ellis was probably a verbal error or whatever, it's not 4,000 tickets that were terminated. It was over 40,000, which the Controller and Auditor General identified as being terminated in a year and a half's period. The actual amount identified in the Garda report was around 66,000 for a longer period of time. Now, as Minister Shatter said earlier, some of those terminations could be easily explained. Some of them related to tax discs on vehicles which had transferred ownership or whatever, and they were, or the driver couldn't be identified and so on, but some of them couldn't. And it is appalling that areas, if you look at the numbers of those which were revealed in the Controller and Auditor General's report today, which related to commercial vehicles, problems of which were identified in the penalty point system 6, 7, 8 years ago, that you can't obviously put a penalty point on a company. It has to be put on an individual. So there is an absolute requirement to make companies be accountable to say who's driving their vehicle if a traffic offence is occurred, because with so many tickets written off, in effect, between cases not being pursued through summonses not being issued and summonses remaining unpaid, about 75% of the summonses issued on commercial vehicles remained unpaid and were never pursued, which is actually the inverse relationship of the scenario with ordinary drivers' penalty points. So if we want to deal with the issue of road safety, then we have to deal with the issue of drivers of commercial vehicles, and that is something that needs to be addressed and addressed immediately. And it strikes me that there is a timely good fortune with this legislation being introduced today alongside the Controller and Auditor General's report. I'd imagine the Minister could factor in some standards on this. And I really would like to know what the Minister's view is in relation to the need to have an independent assessment of this situation, because we now have a number of reports which reveal huge discrepancies. In some ways, Minister Shatter earlier is in part correct when he says that Assistant Commissioner O'Mahony's report revealed levels of terminations of around the 5%, which was roughly akin to the figure revealed by the Controller and Auditor General. But his attempts to then move on and sort of dismiss that as hardly relevant do not stand up to the facts that are behind that, which means tens of thousands of terminations, hundreds of terminations relating to vehicles on multiple occasions, including at least 3 members of the judiciary in that category. Now, that's a problem in our penalty point system. If members of the judiciary are benefited from having penalty points terminated, and then they're sitting in our courts adjudicating on the cases of other people, there's actually a very strong body of legal argument which would say that anybody who was convicted on the word of a guard who gave that judge the termination could have their driving penalty points and fines quashed because of the unlawfulness of that interference. So to my mind, you are correct, Minister, in your call at the time when the original O'Mahony report and the GPSU reports came out to demand that they dictated the need for an independent inquiry. And I think that still stands, because the Minister for Justice is wrong when he stated earlier that members in this House, I think he was talking about me, said that the new criteria were only a replication of what existed before. I didn't say that. What I actually said was that a whole number of measures in the report reiterated protocols which were already there. Not the full picture. It was already unlawful for officers to terminate tickets outside their districts, but loads of them did it. It was already unlawful for them to do so without a written request and without a paper trail, but they did it, and did it on numerous occasions. It was unlawful for them to do it without an excuse, but they did it, and so on. Some of the new measures which restrict the access which officers have to the system are welcome. The provision of an audit is welcome. They are new measures, but the question has to be asked, is the political will there to say that this criteria is going to be implemented when previous ones weren't? And you can only judge that by the people who are doing the implementing. And without being personal about it, the Garda Commissioner and the Assistant Commissioner have systematically sought to minimise this problem, to say it's not a cultural problem, to say it's not a systemic problem, and to basically put it down to a little bit of inadequate accounting. That is not what this is. It is rooted in the present system. And you see, the problem is, if you bring in new criteria and toughened up rules, which do exist now, and I welcome that, but you sort of brazenly pass over what's happened as if you're just bringing them in because you had a really good idea. Not that you're bringing them in based on the evidence that was given to you by two whistleblowers, one of whom has lost his job and the other who cannot conduct his job, and that they're the only ones penalised in this situation. How can that moderate the behaviour of other Gardaí in that regard? Because the consistency in the Controller and Auditor General's report revealed that while these terminations were not widespread around the country, they were located in areas. They can be pinpointed. Areas like Ennis were the top area for penalty points being terminated. Other areas, 50 times the amount that happened in Birr. That's not natural. Obviously, there was something odd going on there. It wasn't that they couldn't identify drivers or whatever. Action needs to be taken, because otherwise the signal that you're given is, well, yes, we're not really even acknowledging that any wrong was done, but we've just kind of dreamt up this new system and we won't acknowledge the past. There has to be a hands up on this situation. People do have to take responsibility for what they stood over, and that responsibility rests primarily on the shoulders of the leadership of An Garda Síochána, who I have to say have not equipped themselves very well in this, because contrary to what the Minister for Justice stated here today, he had a bad day today with the number of inaccuracies actually in his comments, but the whistleblowing Gardaí did not refuse to cooperate with the investigation. The whistleblowing Gardaí were never asked to cooperate with the investigation. Subsequently, while they were being disciplined, in a letter from the Garda Commissioner, they were said, well, if you have anything to add, you can give it to John O'Mahony. That is not been asked to participate in an investigation, so the Minister was completely wrong in that regard. I welcome the changes that have been made to this system, but it's not enough. There are a lot of unanswered questions, not least the fact that two vulnerable people have been left exposed in breach of whistleblowing legislation, and that those who stood over the hounding and persecution of those people whose contribution have led us to the situation of improved regulations have to be made pay for that and be accountable for their actions. And if we're to have a really transparent and safe system that everybody knows, if I go out and speed, that a nod and a wink because I'm connected or because my relation is a guard, I'm not going to get off. In order to do that and restore confidence, we need an independent investigation, and I would like you to comment on whether that is still your case, because your attitude, because I agree with that demand, and I disagree strongly with the points made by Garda Commissioner Callanan, who said there wasn't a culture of this, because the facts would state otherwise.